There you go. We're here. Welcome back to the Global Indian Podcast, home to the greatest conversations and the official platform for open and curious minds. Because, yes, let's face it, we are everywhere. Now, as you know, every single week we plunge ourselves into the human experience behind our perceptions of identity, take a second look at the countries we now call home, and tackle those big conversations. Well, a couple of months ago, you remember we had a fantastic conversation with a dear friend of mine, a fellow explorer, and an incredible human being all around. And it is Bob. Now, Bob told me about this charity. He said, Rajan, well, every week we look at these big causes, we take on the bigger discussion pieces, but how often do we have a look at the charities and those people who are making a difference in the countries that we call home, especially those within East Africa? Now, as you know, we've had President Museveni on the podcast. We've had from billionaires to nowheres sharing their stories about what it means to be African and what it is to the rise of the South Asian origin community there. But this week, I'm going to do something different. I'm inviting on a remarkable human being who not only is changing the lives of thousands of people across the region, but more importantly, is creating a better human experience for all. So without further ado, without too much pressure on your shoulders, Jonathan, welcome to the show. It's good to have you here.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rajan. Appreciate it.
I suppose the first question is, why do you just tell the people what it is that you do? Because I find your personal story and the charity that you run an incredibly exciting venture because it really does touch the lives of many people, but also many generations to come.
Thanks. Well, my story started actually in Cornwall. I was born there, brought up there on a farm, and had absolutely nothing to do with Africa at all. Except I remember a primary school teacher telling a story about going on a matatu with chickens under her feet. And it didn't really resonate with me as a conscious thing, but obviously stuck. And when I'd finished doing A-levels, I was looking for something between going on to university. And I found an organization that put you in communities in African countries. And luck of the draw, I ended up being sent to Kenya for 8 months and living as part of a community in a really rural area called Taita Taveta. So I went as an 18-year-old who knew everything, as all 18-year-olds do, and quickly realized
the burden with all our life's issues and solutions all at once.
Yeah, I knew it all. And I realized quickly I knew nothing at all. But I absolutely loved it. And spent the entire time really trying to make connections with people and really get to know the community that I was with, trying to understand the way life was as it was. And, I have to say it was one of those formative moments. And the thing that really, really struck me though was I was there for a period of about a year, and then I was going to come back to the UK and go to university. But my peers and friends there who had equal or better brains, much more in terms of ambition. I didn't completely know what I wanted to do or anything of the sort. They knew they wanted to be an engineer or they wanted to go into politics or whatever it was. They had no mechanism whatsoever to achieve that because education was just too expensive. And they were able to perhaps get through primary school, but secondary school was a real struggle for the family. And they would maybe do a term and then drop out for a year, then go back and do a bit more. And it just seemed completely wrong, that there was no way for anybody to kind of get further in life. And so they were stuck really in a pattern. Their parents had been subsistence farmers, and they would have to be subsistence farmers because there wasn't really a mechanism for not going down that route. And I was wanting back to the UK to do a degree in history, which, it just seemed like there was fundamentally a bit of an issue there. And it was something that I could do something about for one or two of the families that I knew really well. So, rally together friends, family members, send a little bit of money to pay for the education of one or two. And like I said, my time in Kenya really had a big impact on me. And I thought, I really push history to the side. I want to work in international development or something along those lines. And I pursued within history, I looked at kind of things about migration and about colonialism and all the rest of it, and then went on afterwards to do a master's degree in African studies at SOAS. But I think the more I got into looking at international development as an industry, the more I realized it was very complicated. And there were a lot of things about it that did not sit well with me in terms of, I guess, the ethics behind it slightly. And what I really wanted to do was enable more people like my friends to have the education to form their own lives, their own experiences, with no expectation, no kind of, but just facilitating, I guess. And so Rafiki Thambo was born. I just decided, well, I know what I want to do, and I can set up a charity. And so with a few friends and my younger brother, we set up the organization. And for the first year, I was thinking, how on earth are we going to raise £1,000 that we need in order to stay current? But actually, it's just grown organically ever since, to the point where now today we're supporting 250 scholars in 3 countries, Uganda, Kenya, and Lesotho. And by supporting, no payments are made directly to the scholars, payments are made directly to the institutions. And that just facilitates them to the fees are paid, basically. They can go without any worry. And once somebody's taken on as a scholar, whether they're taken on in secondary school or just for university, we commit to them that we will see them through their education up to the end of the degree level, or the equivalent. So they can make choices, as I did, freely, to follow whatever it is that their hearts want. Some go into medicine, some go into environmental studies, some go into tourism, business, you name it. There's somebody who's done it, electrical engineering, nursing, teaching, all kinds of things. And I suppose it's, for me, seeing lives transformed is absolutely incredible. I still remember a young man, I'm going to call him Nicholas. He was sort of a shadow of a person, I guess, when I first met him. Very close, very sort of shy, I suppose. Just couldn't look me in the eye. He was very, and after he received an education, I mean, his background was horrible. And once he'd received an education, the man that I saw a few years later was standing upright. He was tall. You could tell he had achieved something. He was proud of himself. He had everything in life going for him. And it wasn't just, an on-paper transformation of a life. This was a life transformed. And somebody who went from being the boy who was stigmatized for being born out of wedlock and picking up rubbish on the streets of Nairobi in order to fund his education, to somebody who's now an accountant, who's set up a business of his own. He helps run the cerebral palsy charity within Kenya. He's giving back because he's had an education. His life has been transformed, and he knows what he's worth, and he has pride in himself, and he knows that he can do the same again. So I feel like I've talked a lot. But
No, not at all. I was going to say, what have you learned about yourself through the charity?
I've learned about myself that it's bigger than me, and it's bigger than any one of us individually. But you have to start, and I think that's the thing. It would be really easy just to say, "There's nothing I can do about this." The political environment of these countries is not going to change. As an individual, what can we do? Therefore, let's not do anything. Nothing actually is going to work. I'm not naive. I don't think that educating 250 scholars and growing each year, but 260, whatever it is going to immediately make a difference. But the point is, it's building blocks. And actually, if you do that, I think it was Nelson Mandela who said, education is the most powerful weapon by which you can change the world. And he's absolutely right. But none of us can, at a master's degree, educate everybody and get ourselves into that position. But you have to start somewhere. And I grew up in a rural part of the UK, in a family that we haven't got military history or any kind of we're all farmers. Like, we didn't really go anywhere for generations beforehand. So I saw something in a very simplistic way. I thought, I can do something about this. And that's the legacy that's happened. You gather people around you, you build a team, you kind of, other people who are inspired, you draw on other people's strengths and their connections and their resources and everything else, and put it all together to go back to the very simple thing of putting scholars through education. And it comes down also to things like terminology. So we don't call Rafiki scholars beneficiaries or anything like that. These are kids who, by their own merit, have got into the academic institution that they got there by themselves, effectively. They're in secondary school, or they've got the grades for it, or they've got the qualifications for university. They just don't have the means. And we're just, the idea behind Rafiki is simply to provide the means, and then that's over to them. Obviously, if we do have, so in each of the countries, there's a committee of local people made from elders in the communities, church leaders, chiefs, people who've got some stature and standing and know their communities that they're in amongst. And they form the committee who take the applications and go through them and check the backgrounds a little bit on the students, make sure that they are genuine and that nobody's pulling the wool over anybody's eyes, and also look behind the pure stats. So you might have an A grade student and then a C grade student, and you think, well, the A grade will go further, so we should prioritize. But actually, maybe that C grade student is a girl who grew up with an alcoholic father and has had to work every day before school and after school, and has no electricity to study at home. And actually that C represents, an A star, given what she's been up against compared to another scholar. So all of that kind of is taken care of within the context of the communities in which we work, because I think it's impossible for me to make that judgment call. To begin with, I would read them through, and every single case to me was deserving, and I couldn't differentiate between them.
What's the biggest misconception people have about charities like yourselves? Because I know we've spent a lot of time across Africa, Nigeria through to again Malawi, Zambia, places that you guys are, Uganda, looking at Kenya. And often people say, well, look, Rajan, there's a lot of charities in operation here. They're all saying that they're doing great work, but hang on, why do the same issues continue to persist 30, 40 years on?
Yeah. I mean, I looked at this a little bit during my master's degree, and that's what kind of put me off. I think if there's ever a kind of concept that somebody from outside of that situation will know better and be able to kind of push an agenda through that will work, because it's the West knows best mentality, I guess, and I avoid that, scream away from it, because I just think the brains are there, the ambition is there. These are people who know their country, they know their political situation, the cultural situation, they know everything about their own environment, and they are the ones who are going to be the future leaders and who are going to transform their country. It's not for outside charities to do that. So I think the best charities are ones who recognize that and who work to enable and facilitate within the country. I mean, maybe I'm a bit simplistic on it, but it's just the way I see it. And I think that's probably where we get a lot of support, is people like the fact that we are based on relationship. I know the committee in Kenya personally, and have known certainly Libison, who chairs the committee, and several of them for over 20 years now. And I can trust them totally. Our model doesn't hive off money to middlemen or anything else. It goes simply into an account and then it's distributed, and every transaction is traceable. The scholars are all on WhatsApp, and if the fees are missing for whatever reason, they got held up or something, we're getting WhatsApp saying what's happened here. So we know that there's no room really for money to go astray, and can be quite straight with people about that. And I think that's really important, because people like to know that what they give goes to the cause that they're giving. And I suppose what we struggle slightly with is we do some infrastructure projects around education, because we know it doesn't exist in a vacuum. So in Uganda recently, some girls were attacked on the way home from school. And the reason why they were going to and fro school every day was because the dormitories were in such poor repair that they weren't fit for anybody to stay in them. And so they were doing long distances, and during the rainy season, they were vulnerable and they got attacked, and it was horrific. And we said to the school, what can we do? And they said, well, if we could restore the dormitories, then that would solve the issue. So we raised funds and restored the dormitory, and the girls were then able to stay in school. And every girl, after the girls got attacked, left. They didn't want to risk being the next ones caught on the way to and fro. So we do infrastructure projects, and we can usually attract funding for those. But what we struggle to attract funding for is the individual transformation of scholars from being uneducated and feeling like they've got no hope, because why would anybody care about them? How can they change their situation? They have no agency, no voice, no mechanism to change their life, through to actually gaining an education, gaining the pride that comes with that, and the knowledge and the sense that actually they do have a voice, and that they have value as an individual in society. And the reflected pride that comes to their parents and the older generations who never imagined that one of their children would have a degree, and then they start earning and can support their siblings and their cousins, and and any other random, because they were supported randomly, they will support other people randomly. So there's a big ripple effect. But what we struggle is to translate that into a way that is, I guess, tangible for organizations that like boxes and like to say, we've given X, it costs this, and the outcome is this. We don't know what the outcome will be. My absolute dream is that one day it will be a Rafiki scholar. I'll fly myself into Nairobi, and the car will wait for me and take me to the official presidential residence, because there's a Rafiki scholar there who has invited me for a cup of tea. I would love that, because that would show that the system works. Education raises people up. If you've got the ability and an education, you should be able to do whatever.
I feel that behind this smile, there's a bit of frustration there in terms of how society works. And I think it's a valid frustration. What are they for you?
Well, I suppose it is slightly frustrating, but because one of the things of Rafiki is that we are about relationship, and the relationship is across the water between Africa and the UK. Lots of the scholars imagine that the UK, you can pull money off trees, and that it's basically ATM machines just dishing out cash everywhere. And if only they could come to the UK, life would be good. And we all know that that's not the case. And equally, if I go into schools in the UK, you ask what are the thoughts of Africa, and the first things that pop up are things about poverty, about drought, about corruption. And both of those things in a way have truth, that the UK is comparatively wealthy, and there are issues in across Africa, but they're not exclusive to either. And I sort of then challenge the kids and say, well, how many billionaires do you think there are in Africa? What resources do you think there are across the continent? You meant music, the richness of the cultural tapestry, the sheer number of languages. It's not one homogeneous blob, Africa. It's even things like that which sort of frustrates me, and that people still have in mind that the way to help is to send a cow or send a bike or something along those lines. And you think, well, actually, the way to help really would be to educate somebody as a mechanic who can build the bike. And actually, that's where I think true transformation happens, and we get that relationship and that dialogue between people across different nations and across the world. And the more we understand one another, the better.
Yeah,
I mean,
I suppose we often see the world as we are rather than how it is. And so therefore the
yeah,
way in which we experience the situations can be based upon our internalized experience of life as a whole. And if most people aren't traveling, if most people are just looking at a selective mode of media, it narrows in their
yes,
vision. And I get that there is another frustration that very rarely do we often say live on air, and it is looking at the governments in those countries, because a lot of people will accurately say, well, look, Jonathan, the work that you're doing, surely that's what the government of that country should be doing. The work that you're doing, you're building up this dormitory to stop these girls from being harassed. Well, weren't those the promises of that government that got put into place, or that local mayor? Well, hang on, what are the local police for? And then hang on, and
yeah,
it goes down because you can see this vicious circle where people are saying, well, there's so much aid that is being sent over there. Where is that money being spent? How do you answer questions like that? Because I know on your side, you can say, Rajan, I will only do what I can do. Whatever I can
yeah.
touch, whatever I can see, we'll make a support system, but everything else is a bit harder. But there's going to be a bit more there, isn't there?
I mean, the way I see it is that in, and I mean, I have to say, you know, I'm not a politician, and I'm not. Again,
The disclaimer shall be shown at the
everything.
bottom of the screen. Absolutely.
Yeah, disclaimers here. But the way I see it is that there's nothing really. If you're at the top of society, why would you want to change it in a way? In that it's very comfortable. You have a great life, and the status quo works for you. And it's the same. If you look back in the history of the UK, you know, for years and years and years, just centuries, there was a very elite class who ruled, and everybody else, you know, the vote. I mean, it's not that distant to history that women got the vote, for instance. And I don't see that these nations which were created, you know, carved out of by the colonial powers, in a way, I think the way that they're set up at the moment suits those who are in power, and perhaps that is what it is, and that's what education can change. You know, the freedom of journalism in Kenya, for example, is something that I think has, in the last 20 years, grown exponentially, and that is causing holding government to account in a way that prior to that they didn't have to bother with. They could just close down the story and not worry about it. So I think it is happening and it is changing. And I think that the more people who have an education and recognize that they have a voice, and in that voice have every right to be heard, actually, and also they just have the confidence to collaborate and to say, you know, at every level, things can change. But I think it's raising up effectively like a middle class, I guess. I don't know how you say it.
I think what I think is incredible about what you do, and it's extraordinary, is that you're providing the flourishment of the human experience. Because a lot of people are looking at charities, and unfortunately, I think one of these things that I think is incredibly wrong, it's toxic, is that we look at continence based upon the arbitrary factor of skin color. And so therefore, when you don't look like you're part of that community or that tribal symbolism, then therefore there's this ulterior motive. But I think what's happening now, there's a change in consciousness, whereas human beings, we've realized that we're born on this planet. We're not born in a country. We're not born in a continent. Those are all man-made type of ideals. But we're born in this country. We're born on the planet. And therefore, there has to be a social custodianship that we take place to work with each other without fear or favor, to say, how do we create a better experience for all? And although I know what you're meaning before, the colonial powers that be were this small segment of community that happened to be in the UK, who ruled everybody else around the world, including those that were in the UK that were just surviving. They had a very harsh time. But now it has to shift. And I think what your charity is doing is really putting that thread of saying, well, what does social justice look like? What does social mobility look like? And how can you operate and do this? Again, being blindfolded to say, this is what makes the world a better place for all. Because ultimately, then that Rafiki scholar that's sitting there in Kenya, or if they're sitting there in Uganda, and they did incredibly well, that ripple effect is not just on that side of the planet, but it's also felt here. And likewise, I
Absolutely.
think there's a change in narrative of what you're pushing towards this idea of what it means to be African as well. That is not just about the big power brokers that be that all stand there to attention, but it's about those little people who are now rising up to say, my voice too matters, my human experience matters. And therefore, then, if you're not providing the service, other people will. And with that power comes the ability to reshift and reimagine what the economy looks like, but also the ecology for the youth of those countries. Like, it's an incredible job that you've done there. And there's obviously frustrations along that line. There's challenges, there's blood, sweat, and tears. Least be said, you probably had a fuller head of hair when you first started this voyage. Like us all, it's a solar panel for your charisma. That's what it is, Jonathan. But where we are now is you're setting up events. You're doing things in the UK, in the very heart of the UK, to bring incredible minds together to help raise the profile of the charity. Now, you're doing that during a time of COVID or this economic austerity that's happening, but yet people are flocking to these events. What is it that you're doing? What is that human aspect that you're touching upon that's enabling people to actually want to be involved in here? Because you got an event, for example, in only a couple of days from now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in a few days, we're having a gala dinner at Draper School in London with Ranulph Fiennes speaking, and one of the greatest explorers perhaps who's ever lived. And he, in a way, you think, well, why would you have him? But in a way, he kind of symbolizes the challenge, I suppose, that some of the scholars have. Actually, it's different, but how do you get an education? It's like where a scholar can start to where their dream is the equivalent of being dreaming to get to the top of Everest, or dreaming to get across the polar regions. It's such an unsurmountable challenge that it's going to take every focus and attention to get there. But I think that the reason why I think people connect with us and that we are making traction is that, we're a tiny organization. I don't actually work for the charity at all. In my day job, I'm a garden designer, and I chair the trustees. We've got 3 part-time employees who are all amazing in what they do, but they're doing everything. They're doing the social media posts, they're working at reconciling the accounts, everything, like right across the board, because we firmly believe that we need to minimize the amount of spend that goes on in the UK and maximize what we can send to fulfill the cause. We're also really completely blessed that we have an endowment fund that was left to us by a PricewaterhouseCoopers. It's a longer story, but the reality is a lot of our core expenses are covered by an endowment payment, a dividend payment each year. So I think one of the things that really helps is that we genuinely can look people in the eye and say, what you donate, we use. And we have such close connections, we can say, we don't like to, typically we don't tend to kind of link people with scholars, because I think there's a bit of a power dynamic in that I don't, it's a bigger story, but I'd perhaps not want to go into, but
but it makes sense. I like the fact that you're doing it in a blinded fashion, because you're saying you're doing this because you want to make an impact for many people, not just one. So therefore, regardless of what the person looks like, you're there to support. It's a human story of us all.
Yeah. And we can feed it back, and we have scholars write to us perhaps 6 years after they've graduated, and we don't hold any scholar. They've got no contract with us. Like, they don't have to do anything at all, because again, I don't believe in that. I think people need to be free, and you can't put strings on. The only thing we'd say is if they're in school, they have to be in school. Like, they can't drop out and still get paid each year for their education. They've got to be working. But there's only been 1 or 2 instances where things have gone wrong for a scholar and went down a bad path or something. But 6 years later, you get a message on Facebook saying, I'm charity, you helped me. I just wanted to say I'm now married, I've got 2 children and my own business, and I was thinking back and wanted to thank you. And it's stuff like that you just think, it's amazing. Like, it's absolutely amazing. And we can tell that story, and we can tell that story for, at the moment we're supporting 260. I can't remember how many we have supported in the past, but as the years go by and we take on more and more scholars, actually there's a bigger and bigger alumni of scholars who are there forming their own communities in each of the countries, and even the Ugandan ones are WhatsApping the Kenyan ones. We kind of get this cross-pollination, I guess, between the scholars, who some are employed and they can look out for internships or job opportunities within their organization. And I guess knowing that it's a Rafiki scholar, it's almost like you're a known entity in a little part. Like, you've completed stage 1 of the background check because you also went through that.
Do you also get a special funny handshake then when you become a Rafiki scholar? Is that what it is?
It's a wink. No. The reality is, it's so nice to see that happen, because it breaks down barriers between different ethnicities within each of the countries.
Jonathan, what's your biggest fear? Because you're working directly with the charity side, you're working with people's emotions, you're working with people's futures, but with that also comes a recognition of what can go wrong if you guys aren't there.
Yeah. So we could take on a lot more scholars if we went year to year, but we always kind of try to forecast sort of 5 years that the 260, we know we can look after their fees until each of them is graduated. So we forecast it forward. My biggest fear really is, it comes back to, in the UK, I hate to make a nuisance of myself and be the person who pesters people all the time. So we are constantly, when we're in a good situation, I think there was an expression, you've got to fix the roof while the sun shines. And it's pushing out to reach the next audience and to expand the message further and to make sure that this is a sustainable model, because it's sustainable in terms of people are feeding into us financially, but also in terms of experiences and everything else, and that we don't overburden any particular. My family, for example, they'd be like, "Oh no, he's coming again. It's going to ask for some more money." But that's my biggest fear.
Besides the finances, what's your biggest social fear? I suppose we do, in a way, a lot of that is taken off my shoulders, because we have the committees in each of the countries who also kind of take on a mentoring role with the scholars as well. And like when the girls were attacked, or when things go wrong, they are there to step in and to help out. I think that when we didn't have such an established committee role, and I was reading each of the applications and feeling personally responsible for each one of them that came to me, knowing that I couldn't help them because we didn't have the funds and all the rest of it, that would really worry me and sit heavily with me. But thankfully, our committees actually absorb a lot of that. And I think, I suppose, rather than a worry, I have a hope that one day we'll become obsolete and won't be needed, because the government will change and they'll change their priorities, and education will become accessible for everybody, and that society will start to shape itself in a way that there is social mobilization and social justice and all those things that we talked about, that is happening within the countries. But yeah, I'd say that was really my hope. It's a hope rather than a fear. I suppose if I read between the lines, the biggest issue is that there's so much insecurity right now in the world in which we live in. You look at these countries, and it's not just looking at towards Africa. This is a worldwide phenomenon. Other countries, even here in the UK, we have people that are on the brink of starvation. We've got food banks that are set up. And we've lived in a life where we place a great reliance on the integrity of those who are elected to lead. And now we're seeing time and time again, those promises, those fragile promises is being broken. And then the people who are left who actually try and make a difference are the average people like yourself who say, do you know what if? what can change, what can make the world a better place, even by just a percentage. At least it makes a difference. And I suppose there's a growing frustration there saying, well, if we all champion change, even as consumers, to say, let's have some consciousness of what do we buy? Where do we buy it from? What is the impact of those purchases? And then also have a look at our own economic policies, because ultimately we're voters, we're taxpayers, and say, well, what's been done with our money? What's been done with our country? And if we took that power back in our hands, then we have the chance to make the world the place that we all claim it should be. But the problem is, there's almost this lack of empathy going around that is more contagious than bloody COVID, because people seem not to give a dying shit about things. And surely that must be an element of frustration, because you're seeing the impact that you make. And even within countries like Kenya, in countries like Uganda, there's tremendous wealth there. There's many people of South Asian origin who live in these countries. Uganda is a classic example. We saw what happened with the likes of Idi Amin. He kicked out 80,000 Asians, but 500,000 Ugandans were murdered, tortured. Families were just separated. Businesses, small sector businesses were closed. And so you just toppled entire generations into abject poverty. Now, whereas South Asia's done quite well there, I suppose the elephant in the room is saying, well, what about those 500,000 people whose families were absolutely lost? What have we done to almost rebalance the books? Not in the sense of duty, but in the sense of saying, well, surely Uganda means something to us. We mean something to it. Let's all work together hand in hand. When you go to these countries, when you go into Kenya, you go into Uganda or any of the other countries that you're now emerging into, and you speak with the business community there, and you tell them about the work that you do, what is the response that you get?
I think people are always positive, always positive, and welcome it. But I wouldn't say that within Kenya we're not massively supported. And part of it is we're a very small organization, and we're slightly limited by the fact that we're not there regularly. Face to face is by far the best way to build a relationship and to get to know people and to feel like you've made a personal connection and you can trust one another and work together. And it's something I think that we would love to do more. And recognizing that there are phenomenally wealthy people in each of the countries that we work in, as well as people who have next to nothing. And I suppose it isn't an area that we have done a huge amount. It's a perfect truth, but it's something that we know we would love to do and love to do more, because it absolutely makes sense. And I think that we're not working against what the government is doing. The scholars that we support are in institutions that already exist within the country. They're following the curriculum of the country. So we're sort of having that balance, I guess, between not challenging politically the status quo, but trying to put people in. Exactly.
Because you work almost in unison. I can see the linear thought of yours is saying, actually, we work alongside the government to say, how do we make a better world for all? And you recognize the government may have challenges. I'll play the song. So the government does have challenges, but on the other side, it's saying, well, where those challenges exist, the charity can pick up and see what more they can do, provide, further social support. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it all comes back to a recognition that, my fellow trustees in the UK, we are geographically separated, and no matter how much time you can spend in the communities, and you're not part of the community unless you're part of the community, if you see what I mean. And you can have the dialogue and you can really understand somebody else, but actually it's so much more powerful if it comes from within that community. And that's, I guess, where education comes into it, because you're empowering people to speak up and articulate their narratives, their stories, their truth, that are not, there can't be any kind of political agenda behind it or anything else. It is simply people who are, expressing their lived experiences and able to challenge status quo from within. There's no angle on it, I guess, and that's what I'm always desperately keen to avoid.
Yeah, absolutely. Jonathan, it's been fantastic having you on the show. I know that if people want to find out more about your work, where do they go? How can they engage?
Well, we have a website, which is Rafiki Thambo Foundation. That's the name of the organization. Rafiki is the Swahili word for friend, and Thambo is a Sesotho word for happiness or blessing. So that's the concept behind this. So we're friends who provide blessing, and our website is www.rafiki.foundation.org.uk. There is another one, which is an American organization called the Rafiki Foundation, and that's not us. That one's got quite an evangelical Christian element to us, and so yeah, we've got a nice green logo and the rest of it. But online, drop us an email. Like I said, we're a really small organization, so you're not going to get lost in any system. We're very responsive. We're on Twitter, we're on Instagram, and Facebook as well. We're here. We're very accessible in every way.
Done. Great. Thank you very much, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you, Rajan.